Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Back in 1962, sociologist and political activist Michael Harrington published a book entitled The Other America. It was a deep and prescient look at poverty in America. In it, he argued that a full 25% of Americans were living in poverty. The book had a profound impact on both Jack and Bobby Kennedy, and some said it was responsible for Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. 41 years later, in 2003, John Edwards spoke of two Americas, a nation divided by race and by poverty. And today, a full 58 years after Harrington's look at poverty, the homeless crisis is worse than ever. The streets of cities large and small are living evidence. The opioid and drug crisis has hollowed out large parts of the country, and the latest proposed federal budget reaches new heights in cutting social safety net programs on a federal level. It's hard to imagine that there's hope for the country or for those left behind. This is the world that Pulitzer Prize-winning authors Nick Kristoff and Sheryl WuDunn look at through a very personal lens in their latest work, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. Nicholas Kristoff is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, where he served as bureau chief in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo, and won a Pulitzer Prize for his columns on Darfur. Kristoff and Sheryl WuDunn are the authors of 5 previous books. Together, they were awarded a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China, and their previous books include the bestsellers Half the Sky and A Path Appears. It is my pleasure to welcome Nicholas Kristoff and Sheryl WuDunn here to talk about Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. Nick, Sheryl, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, Jeff, we're delighted to join you.
Well, it's great to have you here. Nick, I want to begin with you. This is really told through the lens of your hometown back in Yamhill, Oregon, that you went back to find a pretty depressing scene, a far cry from the community that you grew up in. Talk about that first.
That's right. So Yamhill, I like to think of it as God's country. I had a wonderful childhood. For a long time, it really seemed to represent upward mobility, and a lot of families have done very, very well for much of the 20th century. It's a population of about 1,000. At the beginning of the coastal range, a lot of people are employed in agriculture, timber, and light manufacturing. My mom is still on the family farm there. And Sheryl and I would be reporting around the world, and then we'd go back to Yamhill to see old friends, and we it was kind of hard to process what we saw. There were a lot of people dying from drugs, from alcohol, suicide. A quarter of the kids on my old number 6 school bus have now passed away from drugs and alcohol, suicide, and related pathologies. And we gradually came to see that this wasn't a problem of one bus or one small town, but a great social depression that is afflicting much of America and indeed has brought down life expectancy for 3 of the last 4 years.
There's lots that you talk about in the book, in Tightrope, about how to address this and our ability to address this. How important is it, Sheryl, to understand the causes of this in order to begin to address it? To what extent do we have to be reductive about trying to understand what happened?
I think it's really important for us to understand certainly as many of the causes as we can. For instance, when we think that, people who are engaged in drugs may be addicted to drugs and they carry a bag of heroin from New York to Alabama, as one of the people in our book we described, Geneva Cooley, did, they just said, okay, she's dangerous, even though this is a nonviolent crime. They put her in jail for 999 years. Well, what she really needs is something more like treatment, if that's the case, if her addiction is overwhelming her. And with many others who were incarcerated because they were small-time drug users, what they really need, if the underlying reason for them committing the crime is drug treatment. If you're really comparing who are the criminals, if you look at the pharmaceutical companies that basically got far more people addicted to opioids, that's another area to look.
Nick, talk a little bit about what it was like for you seeing these people, really a sense almost of survivor's guilt in seeing what had happened to this town.
It is. That's exactly what it is. The kids who got on the school bus right after me were the 5 Knapp kids, and they were smart and talented. Farland was my year. The others were younger. Zealand, Nathan, Keelan, and Regina. And Farland is dead of liver disease after years of alcohol and drug abuse. Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Nathan blew himself up cooking meth, and Regina died from hepatitis after using injectable drugs. And the only survivor was Keelan, the youngest, who survived because he spent 13 years in the state penitentiary. And, trying to understand how their house went through this inferno and mine did not, and what could have been done by the school, by the community to lead to different results. That's kind of the mission of Tightrope.
And in many ways, though, we are more siloed than ever in the way we look at this. And there has been this mantra for so long that you talk about, that these people just made bad choices, that they needed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Well, of course, we do believe that people are responsible for their actions. I mean, definitely people, need to account for the fact that if they don't graduate from high school, they're just not going to get as good a job as if they did graduate from high school. And if they start using drugs, they're going to go down a path that makes it much more difficult for them to maintain a job and raise a good family than if they didn't start drug use. So definitely there are some issues there. But you also have to realize that there are times when we need to give people second and third chances. Not everybody is perfect, and if they make a mistake, they need a nudge or they need some help to lift them up. And that's where we think that it's much more important for us to give them a hand up if they have problems. And one of the people that we talk about in the book, he was homeless, he was addicted to drugs, and we started interviewing him, and we asked him, do you think that this is your fault? He goes, oh, it's absolutely my fault. I made a lot of bad decisions. And then we started asking his background. Well, he was born with drugs in his system. He saw his brother shot when he was 3 years old, shot dead. He himself was shot in the head when he was 5. He had lead poisoning. I mean, it was one after the other. And so you can understand why someone in this situation, he could use a little bit of help.
Yeah, Jeff, let me just add that, I think this bootstraps narrative has been so pernicious because it has ended up being an excuse not to help people. And it's also been internalized, as Sheryl suggested, by a lot of people who are struggling themselves, and has led to a sense of defeatism, to a collapse of self-esteem, a sense that they are failures. Obviously bad choices are real and irresponsibility is a problem. But if we're going to have that conversation about personal irresponsibility, then we also have to have a conversation about our collective social responsibility, especially to kids. When you can look at a child based on the zip code in which they're born and predict their outcomes 20 years later based on just that zip code, then you know that it's not because that infant is making bad choices, because society is.
How pernicious is this idea of wanting to look back to an America gone by, looking at America of the 50s and 60s and somehow thinking that therein lies the answer? Nick?
I think it's misleading because a lot of that golden time, it was it was a period of racial discrimination, a period when women were not empowered. But there is also something to be noted for the period roughly from 1945 through the 1970s, when we had rapid economic growth that was also quite fairly divided. The pie was growing, but also inequality was declining. And we also had investments in physical capital and in human capital and interstate highways and state universities and community colleges that laid the groundwork for inclusive growth in the years ahead. So, those are the parts that I'd like to revive, that sense of inclusive growth, of a capitalism that worked for everybody, rather than the sort of blind nostalgia for kind of a bootstraps era that, in fact, did not exist. This was the era of the GI Bill of Rights, which was all about helping people up, not about telling them to lift themselves up.
And Sheryl, one of the other aspects of this is the way in which we all pay a price for this, even those that don't live in these communities, that may not interact, that there is a price in terms of competitiveness and success that the entire country pays.
Oh, absolutely. When women joined the workforce in the latter half of the last century, we had a huge boon to the economy, and they started contributing to the GDP because they were underutilized, resource in the entire country. Likewise, we have a similar situation now where you have so many Americans who are just underutilized as a resource. If we can lift them up, we can actually create a much more economic power. Especially if we're going to start competing with, and we are continuing to compete with China, which has 1.4 billion people, and obviously India, which will be even larger than that. They have huge amounts of people power. And if we want to get back to number one, or if you believe that we are number one, we need to use as many of those that people power as we can by lifting Americans up so that they can be productive human beings. Right now, we have so many less productive, even unproductive people in America, and they aren't able to contribute to the economy.
Why are we not talking about this more in the political realm, Nick? Why do we have lots of subjects that come up every week for debate and discussion among politicians, and yet things like housing programs and drugs and the state of the poor in rural America doesn't seem to work its way to the top of the food chain of discussion?
I think it's because, in general, these issues don't get adequate attention, and part of the blame for that, I think, has to be laid at the feet of those of us in journalism. I don't think we've done an adequate job covering this. I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were enormously important subjects, and they deserved that coverage. But it's also true that every 2 weeks, we in America lose as many people from drugs, alcohol, and suicide as were lost in 18 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think part of it is the lack of attention, and that if you're in the first-class cabin in the U.S., you don't fully notice what's going on below decks, and you may not notice the hole in the hull that threatens the whole venture. I also think, frankly, that post President Trump's election, there have been a lot of liberals who have completely given up on the white working class, and I think that's a mistake. The white working class tends to be socially conservative, and so on issues like abortion or guns, they're more likely to vote for, or immigration, they're more likely to vote for Republicans. But on economic issues, they're actually more liberal. So if the issue is healthcare or is raising the minimum wage or parental leave programs, then Democrats have a fighting chance to win over those votes. And I hope in this year, in the presidential race and in Senate races, I hope they make their case.
One of the other aspects of this that really is so clear in the things that you write about, in the stories that you tell, particularly from Yamhill and other places, is the multi-generational aspect of this and how the problems layer upon each generation. Talk about that, Sheryl.
Well, that's what's so critical, is the next generation. And we forget that, when we have people who are addicted to drugs and they have kids, what's going to happen to those kids? Right now, one baby every 15 minutes is born with exposure to opioids in their system. I mean, how many babies do you think that, who are in that situation are going to be growing up to be going to Ivy League institutions? What we need is to address these kids when they're young. We need early childhood education. we need to, get those kids, address the challenges that they're facing if they are in the midst of what we call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. When those ACEs start to pile up, those kids are in real danger during the time when their brain is expanding at its most rapid rate. We think of kids as totally resilient, but no, they actually are vulnerable, especially when they're young. And we right now want to make sure that we can course correct their trajectory when it's a lot more cost effective than 2 decades later when they're either troubled, they're troubled teenagers and troubled, kids in their 20s who are going to, go down a really bad path. Even now, we can actually predict the outcomes of an infant based on the zip code that they're born in. And so we know that when we can do that, we can certainly say that this is not the personal responsibility of those little babies.
Nick, talk about mobility and why so many of these people are so stuck in where they are. There was a time in this country where people left, moved around for jobs, moved around for opportunity. There seems to be such a tremendous lack of mobility today.
So, this is an issue that is debated, and I don't think we fully understand it, why geographic mobility has declined. But I think that one issue is the cost of housing, that the areas that tend to have more economic opportunity also have very expensive housing and require a certain amount of, cash up front to move to that place. So that if you want to move to the Bay Area of California, then you may be able to find a job, but you're going to have, several $1,000s to go there and find a place. It's also true that various benefit programs are not very portable across state lines. And so people who are getting some kind of support then find it difficult and cumbersome to change states, or if you're on Medicaid, for example. But I also think, frankly, it's kind of a lack of information, and that people often don't fully appreciate what they can do and can get somewhere else, or the opportunities for their children. And there have been some programs that show just small nudges telling people about greater opportunities elsewhere actually have far-reaching results.
And yet, Nick, you remain optimistic.
I do. Look, these are enormous challenges, and, it's obviously too late for many of the kids on my bus, but we have the toolkits to address these problems. We know how to make a difference because, frankly, just about every other country in the world does it. Automation, globalization, these affect Canada and Germany, but you don't see lifespan declining in those places. And it is so frustrating that we have the tools, but we can't seem to summon the political will. I hope that this election year will be a chance to shine more of a spotlight on these issues, not only on the problems, but also on the solutions.
Nicholas Kristoff, Sheryl WuDunn. The book is Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. Nick, Sheryl, I thank you both so much for spending time with us.
Thank you,
We really appreciate it.
Thank you.